Alright, so now we're going to jump right into the program and start off with the basics. Change of address. So pharmacists must notify the Kentucky State Board of Pharmacy of changes to an address within 30 days of making the change. So it's pretty simple there, and that can be done online. Licensing, continuing education, and renewal. So continuing education is different for every state pretty much. There are some states that are very similar, and as we progress with different things happening therapeutically, with increased responsibility with regards to patient care and patient interaction, whatnot, in pharmacy, we are starting to see more changes regarding certain requirements of what is to be completed or what is acceptable continuing education credit to be completed by pharmacists in various states throughout the country when they are seeking to renew their licenses. So with regards to that, for instance, in the state of Kentucky, every 10 years, the pharmacists are actually expected to do a CE on HIV/AIDS. So, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but as far as the continuing education credits that are required by a pharmacist seeking to renew his license or her license in the state of Kentucky, the state board requires that 1 5/10 continuing education units or 15 contact hours be completed. And to help you understand what this means, Kentucky actually measures their continuing education units differently than other places. Normally, a continuing education credit is viewed as like being 1/10 of something, from what I've seen in the past and what I've typically seen elsewhere, especially when you have certain continuing education companies or continuing education sessions or courses or whatnot that you can participate in. They will sometimes be referenced in terms of continuing education units, where essentially you're multiplying by a factor of 10 or dividing by a factor of 10. But here it's different for the state of Kentucky, where what they refer to as a continuing education unit, if you're comparing it in terms of contact hours, then 1 contact hour is equivalent to essentially 50 minutes of continuing education. So that is the conversion factor there to try to figure out what that would be. Now, first-year licensees in the state of Kentucky are not required to complete continuing education, so that's important to note that if you are a pharmacist who is newly licensed in the state of Kentucky, you are not required to complete any CE for that next year to renew your license. Okay, and then the renewal period is actually January through March 15th of every year. And basically, that's the period that you have to renew. Every state has something different. Some states renew based off of the birth year. Some states renew based off of just a certain period. Sometimes there are certain states that actually renew more towards the middle of the year or during the second quarter. This just happens to be the renewal period here. Some states renew every 2 years, every 3 years, or whatnot. This is an annual process in Kentucky. And as I mentioned earlier, every 10 years, pharmacists who are licensed in the state of Kentucky must complete 1 contact hour or 0.1 continuing education units, specifically concentrating on HIV AIDS. So there we're getting into is not that the state board is telling you the area you should specialize in therapeutically. Obviously, if you only update your knowledge of HIV, AIDS, pharmacotherapy or whatnot to whatever extent that might be or whatever that might look like every 10 years, you probably won't be considered an expert in that field. But this is just an example. There are some states that specify that every time you renew your license, you have to complete X amount of hours of training on the subject of pharmacy law. So, you know, states vary, and this is just a unique situation with Kentucky. Okay, now finally for reciprocity. So I wanted to mention this, especially if there are some of you who might be sitting for multiple boards, depending on what your plans are post-graduation. Some students, I know I had several classmates where they sat for boards in several states, and they took the boards for one state first, passed that, and then used that license to reciprocate their license to another state. In general, with regards to reciprocity, you need to have an active, unrestricted license in a state. And you also need to make sure that the state in which you are currently licensed has an agreement of reciprocity with the state that you would like to reciprocate your license to. So in this case, you may be wanting to, you have a license, let's say Ohio or Illinois, and you want to reciprocate your license to the state of Kentucky. In that case, the Kentucky State Board of Pharmacy requires that you actually request an application form from the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy, or the NABP, okay? In addition to that, you are required to take the Kentucky law, the MPJE, multi-state, multi-prudence jurisdiction exam. So that's important to note because some states have different requirements. There are some states where if there's no agreement, obviously for reciprocity, you have to take both the pharmacy law as well as the actual clinical portion of the boards again. And there are some states where if they have an agreement of reciprocity, then you may actually be called on site to be interviewed by the board. And Ohio is an example of this, where you don't take the MPJE, but you are required to appear before the board within, I believe it's 6 months before licensure, and you'll be interviewed. So it's important to know that in this case, this does not apply. You have to request the application form from the NABP. You have to sit for the MPJE for the state of Kentucky. And the other thing that's interesting here is that the board actually submits a query to the National Practitioner Data Bank of the United States Department of Health and Human Services, which we commonly refer to as HHS. And they submit this query sort of trying to check on the status of your licensure and that kind of thing. And even though the board is submitting the query on your behalf, you are responsible for paying the query fee as the applicant. And just as I mentioned about states not having reciprocity agreements or other situations, California and Florida tend to be very different when it comes to licensure. So you will see situations where people are seeking to perhaps become licensed in either of these states, or maybe they're licensed in these states and they're wanting to reciprocate elsewhere. But their processes are so different that oftentimes it's just a different situation. And because these states have completely different criteria, you must contact the Kentucky Board of Pharmacy directly to find out what those application criteria are. So I can't really elaborate on that because that's pretty much what they say, and I am not licensed in either of those states, so I can't really speak to what that process would look like. But it is referenced directly from the law that you contact them if you are licensed in these states and seeking to reciprocate to the state of Kentucky.